Jacob had always felt like an outsider in his own family. At just 22 years old, he had spent most of his life watching from the sidelines as his parents doted on his brothers. They were normal, after all. They had girlfriends, attended family gatherings with smiles, and made their parents proud. Jacob, however, was different. He had always known it, but his family's silent disapproval had turned his difference into a burden he couldn't escape. It wasn't that his parents were cruel, but their love was always conditional. It seemed like every smile, every embrace, came with strings attached. His brothers were given the spotlight at family dinners, celebrated for their achievements, while Jacob was left to stew in the background. His brothers didn't hide their disdain for him either. They mocked his quiet demeanor, his solitude, and the fact that he never brought home a girlfriend. They didn't know, how could they, that Jacob's heart ached not for a girlfriend, but for someone who could understand the truth he had been hiding for years. Jacob was gay, and in a household that thrived on appearances, this part of him was not welcome. The tension had been simmering for years, but that night, everything came to a boil. It was a family dinner, like so many others before, where Jacob felt invisible at the table. His father was praising one of his brothers, talking about how proud he was of his achievements, and all Jacob could feel was the weight of being the disappointment. His mother's eyes flickered toward him occasionally, but there was no warmth in them, just expectation. She was waiting for him to be something he could never be. After dinner, as they gathered in the living room, Jacob's youngest brother made a snide comment about his lack of a love life. It was meant as a joke, something for everyone to laugh at, but it cut through Jacob's already raw emotions. He had had enough. "I'm done," Jacob muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible. No one noticed at first. His brothers continued their banter, their laughter echoing in the room. But when Jacob stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor, the room fell silent. "I said, I'm done." His father turned to look at him, eyebrows raised. "Done with what?" "Everything," Jacob said, his voice rising. "I'm done with this house, this family, this lie. You want to know why I'm not like them? Why I don't bring someone home, why I keep to myself? It's because I'm not like you. I'm gay, and I'm done pretending that I'm something I'm not just to fit into your perfect little family." The silence that followed his words was deafening. His brothers exchanged glances, a mixture of shock and disbelief on their faces. His mother looked as though she had just seen a ghost, her hand covering her mouth, while his father's face hardened into a scowl. "You don't mean that," his father said, his voice low but firm. "You're just upset. We'll talk about this later." "There's nothing to talk about," Jacob replied, his voice trembling. "I've been hiding this for years, and I'm tired. I can't be what you want me to be, and I shouldn't have to." Without waiting for a response, Jacob turned and left the room. He grabbed his coat and keys, storming out of the house before anyone could stop him. His heart was pounding, his hands shaking as he slammed the front door behind him. He felt a wave of emotions, fear, anger, but most of all, an overwhelming sense of relief. For the first time in years, he had spoken his truth. But the relief was short-lived. As he walked down the street, the cold night air biting at his skin, reality set in. He had no plan, no destination. He had just left the only home he had ever known, and now he was on his own. Jacob wandered the streets for hours. His mind racing. He didn't know where he was going, but anywhere was better than home. His feet carried him aimlessly through the city until he found himself sitting on a park bench, staring up at the stars. The park was empty, the only sound the distant hum of traffic and the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. He pulled his coat tighter around himself, but it did little to ward off the chill that had settled deep in his bones. Days passed, and Jacob found himself living on the streets. He had no money, no friends to turn to, and every night was a struggle to find a safe place to sleep. The city, which had once seemed full of possibilities, now felt like a cold, unforgiving place. He tried to stay in homeless shelters, but they were often full, leaving him to sleep in alleyways or on park benches. His pride had kept him from reaching out to anyone for help, but that pride was quickly eroding as the days dragged on. One night, after hours of searching for a place to stay, Jacob collapsed on the sidewalk, too exhausted to keep going. He curled up in a doorway, pulling his coat around him and praying for the night to pass quickly. He was on the verge of sleep when he heard footsteps approaching. "Hey," a voice said softly. Jacob opened his eyes and looked up to see a man standing over him. He was older, probably in his late 30s, with a kind face and warm brown eyes. He wore an expensive-looking coat, and there was something about him that made Jacob's guard lower, if only for a moment. "You okay?" the man asked, crouching down to Jacob's level. Jacob didn't answer right away. He was too tired, too defeated to care. "I'm fine," he muttered, though the truth was anything but. The man didn't leave. Instead, he sat down next to Jacob, his presence strangely comforting. "I've seen you around here the last few days," he said. "You look like you could use a place to stay." Jacob's first instinct was to refuse. He didn't want anyone's pity, didn't want to owe anyone anything. But as he looked up at the man, something in his expression told Jacob that this wasn't about pity. It was genuine concern. "I'm Edward," the man said, offering his hand. Jacob hesitated for a moment before shaking it. "Jacob." "Well, Jacob," Edward Said, standing up and offering him a hand. "Why don't you come with me? I've got a guest room that's just sitting empty, and I could use some company." Jacob stared at the outstretched hand for a moment, his mind racing. He didn't know this man, didn't know if he could trust him. But he also didn't have many options. Slowly, he reached up and took Edward's hand, allowing him to pull him to his feet. The warmth of Edward's hand against his own was a stark contrast to the cold that had settled into Jacob's bones over the past few days. For the first time in what felt like forever, Jacob allowed himself to feel a small flicker of hope. Edward's apartment was everything Jacob hadn't expected. It was luxurious, with high ceilings, modern furniture, and a breathtaking view of the city skyline. As they entered, Jacob couldn't help but feel out of place, like a stray cat that had wandered into a palace. "You can stay here for as long as you need," Edward Said, leading Jacob to the guest room. "No strings attached." Jacob nodded, too overwhelmed to say much. The room was warm and inviting, with soft sheets and a comfortable bed that looked far more welcoming than the cold sidewalk he had grown accustomed to. He hadn't slept in a real bed in days, and the thought of sinking into it felt like a dream. "I'll let you get some rest," Edward Said, smiling gently. "If you need anything, just let me know." Jacob nodded again, watching as Edward left the room and closed the door behind him. He stood there for a moment, staring at the bed, unsure of what to do next. It had been so long since he had felt safe, so long since someone had shown him kindness. Part of him wanted to break down, to let the weight of everything that had happened in the past few days wash over him. But he held it in, too tired to even cry. Instead, he sat on the edge of the bed and kicked off his shoes, sliding under the covers. The warmth of the blankets enveloped him, and for the first time in days, he felt a sense of comfort. It wasn't just the bed, it was the feeling of being cared for, of having someone who was willing to help him without expecting anything in return. As Jacob lay there, staring up at the ceiling, his mind drifted to Edward. There was something about him, something calming, something kind. He didn't know why Edward had taken him in, but in that moment, Jacob was grateful. Maybe, just maybe, things were starting to look up. The days that followed were unlike anything Jacob had ever experienced. Edward had a way of making Jacob feel welcome without being overbearing. He didn't pry, didn't ask too many questions about Jacob's past or why he had ended up on the streets. Instead, he simply provided what Jacob needed, a warm bed, food, and the space to heal. In the mornings, Edward would make breakfast, simple things like eggs and toast, but to Jacob, it felt like a feast. After weeks of barely scraping by, the smell of freshly cooked food was enough to bring tears to his eyes. Edward always made sure there was enough for both of them, sitting down at the table with Jacob and chatting casually as if they had known each other for years. "Eat as much as you want," Edward would say with a smile. "You look like you could use it." Jacob, who had grown used to going hungry, would eat slowly at first, unsure of how much he should take. But Edward never seemed to mind. He would refill Jacob's plate without hesitation, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. Beyond food, Edward also brought Jacob small gifts. One day, he came home with a bag of chocolates, handing them to Jacob with a grin. "Thought you might like these," he said, his eyes twinkling. Jacob took the chocolates, his heart swelling with an unfamiliar warmth. It wasn't about the gifts themselves, it was the thought behind them. No one had ever cared enough to do something like that for him before. Another day, Edward surprised Jacob with new clothes. He had noticed that Jacob's old clothes were worn and tattered, so he had gone out and bought him a few outfits. "You should feel comfortable," Edward had said, placing the shopping bags on the bed. "And besides, you deserve something nice." Jacob didn't know how to react. He had never been treated with such kindness before, and it left him feeling both grateful and confused. Why was Edward doing this? What did he want in return? But as the days turned into weeks, Jacob began to understand. Edward didn't want anything from him. He was simply a kind man who had opened his home to someone in need. Jacob tried to shake the feelings of doubt, but years of neglect and rejection had trained him to be cautious. Still, every time Edward did something kind, whether it was cooking breakfast, bringing chocolates, or buying new clothes, Jacob felt a little more at ease, a little more secure in the fact that Edward's intentions were genuine. This wasn't a man looking for something in return. Edward was different. Their time together flowed naturally. Jacob had never experienced this kind of care and attention before, and Edward never made him feel like he had to explain himself or prove his worth. They spent quiet mornings having breakfast, where Edward would chat casually about his day while Jacob listened, still learning how to let his guard down. The conversations weren't always deep, but they were meaningful in their simplicity. Edward had a job that allowed him to come and go as he pleased. He never talked much about it, but Jacob guessed it involved some sort of business. He was always dressed neatly, exuding an air of casual elegance. When he wasn't working, Edward spent time with Jacob, ensuring he was comfortable without smothering him. It was a delicate balance, one that Edward seemed to master effortlessly. For the first time in what felt like forever, Jacob felt like he belonged somewhere. But the more comfortable Jacob grew, the more complex his emotions became. At first, he was grateful for Edward's kindness, and that was all it was, gratitude. But as time passed, gratitude began to morph into something else. Jacob couldn't pinpoint exactly when it started, but soon, he found himself noticing the small things about Edward. The way his smile made his eyes crinkle at the corners, the way his laugh echoed warmly through the apartment, the comforting weight of his presence whenever he sat nearby. Jacob would catch himself staring at Edward sometimes, lost in thought. He admired the way Edward moved through the world with ease, confident but not arrogant, always in control yet so gentle. It was in these moments that Jacob realized he wasn't just grateful, he was falling in love. This realization hit him like a punch to the gut. How could he allow himself to fall for someone like Edward? Edward was kind and compassionate, but he was also straight. Jacob had seen no indication that Edward felt anything more than friendship for him, and he wasn't about to risk ruining everything by confessing feelings that would most likely be rejected. Jacob tried to push the feelings down, but love isn't something you can easily ignore. Every time Edward smiled at him or asked him about his day, Jacob felt his heart ache a little more. He longed to reach out, to close the small physical gap between them, but fear held him back. He feared that if he revealed his heart, Edward would turn away in disgust, and Jacob would be left alone once again. One evening, after they had finished dinner, Jacob found himself sitting on the couch next to Edward. They had fallen into a comfortable silence, the soft hum of the city outside their window filling the space between them. Edward was flipping through channels on the television, but Jacob wasn't paying attention. His mind was racing, his thoughts consumed by the growing weight of his unspoken feelings. "I need to tell you something," Jacob blurted out before he could stop himself. Edward turned to him, his expression curious but relaxed. "Sure, what's on your mind?" Jacob's heart was pounding in his chest. He could feel the blood rushing to his ears, and his hands were trembling slightly. He hadn't planned on confessing, not like this, but now that the words were on the tip of his tongue, there was no turning back. Jacob paused, struggling to find the right words. His throat felt tight, and he had to force himself to speak. "I have feelings for you. Romantic feelings." The silence that followed his confession felt like an eternity. Edward's eyes widened slightly, his brow furrowing as he processed what Jacob had just said. Jacob could feel the tension in the air, and every second that passed felt like a weight pressing down on his chest. Edward finally exhaled, running a hand through his hair as he looked away, his face a mixture of surprise and confusion. "Jacob, I'm flattered, but I'm straight." Jacob had expected this response, but it still hurt more than he anticipated. He nodded quickly, feeling his cheeks burn with embarrassment. I know. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to make things weird. I couldn't keep it to myself anymore. Edward's expression softened, and he turned back to Jacob, reaching out to place a hand on his shoulder. You didn't make things weird, Jacob. It's okay. I've never thought about you like that, and I don't want to lead you on. Jacob forced a smile, even though his heart felt like it was shattering. I understand. I just needed to say it, I guess. Edward gave his shoulder a reassuring squeeze before pulling his hand back. I appreciate your honesty. And I don't want this to change anything between us, okay? Jacob nodded again, but deep down, he knew that things had already changed. He had crossed a line, and now there was no going back to the way things were. The comfortable friendship they had built over the past few weeks suddenly felt fragile, like it could crumble at any moment. For the next few days, Jacob tried to act like everything was normal, but the awkwardness between them was undeniable. Edward seemed unsure of how to navigate the new dynamic, and Jacob felt like he was walking on eggshells, constantly afraid that he had ruined everything. He spent more time alone in the guest room, trying to distract himself from the heartbreak that gnawed at his insides. But Edward, true to his kind nature, didn't let the tension linger for long. One evening, about a week after Jacob's confession, Edward knocked on Jacob's door. Hey, can we talk? Edward asked, his voice gentle but firm. Jacob looked up from where he had been sitting on the bed, his heart sinking at the thought of another painful conversation. Sure, he said, gesturing for Edward to come in. Edward stepped inside, closing the door behind him before sitting down in the chair across from the bed. He looked serious but not angry, and that gave Jacob a small flicker of hope. I've been thinking a lot about what you said, Edward began, his voice calm and measured. And I want you to know that I care about you, a lot. You're important to me, Jacob, and I don't want you to feel like you're not valued here. Jacob's chest tightened, unsure of where this conversation was going. I've never been in a situation like this before, Edward continued, but I've realized that maybe I've been too rigid in the way I think about relationships and love. You've made me question some things about myself that I hadn't really considered before. Jacob's heart skipped a beat, his mind racing to keep up with what Edward was saying. I'm not going to pretend that I know exactly how I feel right now, Edward admitted, his eyes meeting Jacob's with sincerity. But I do know that I care about you, and I want to figure this out. I want to see where this could go. Jacob's breath caught in his throat. He had been so sure that Edward would never return his feelings, and now, hearing this admission, it felt like the ground had shifted beneath him. Are you saying? Jacob's voice trailed off, unable to finish the question. Edward smiled softly, a hint of uncertainty in his expression. I'm saying I'm willing to explore this with you, if you're still interested. Jacob could hardly believe what he was hearing. His heart was pounding in his chest, a mixture of excitement and disbelief coursing through him. I'm definitely still interested, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Edward chuckled, the sound warm and comforting. Then let's take it one step at a time. No pressure, no expectations, just us figuring things out together. Jacob nodded, his heart swelling with a mixture of relief and hope. He hadn't expected this turn of events, but now that it was happening, he couldn't help but feel a glimmer of happiness that he hadn't felt in a long time. Over the next few weeks, things between Jacob and Edward shifted in subtle but meaningful ways. They spent more time together, talking late into the night, sharing stories, and opening up about their pasts. Edward still made breakfast for Jacob in the mornings, but now, there was a quiet intimacy in the way they sat together, their knees brushing under the table, their conversations flowing effortlessly. It wasn't long before Edward started surprising Jacob with even more thoughtful gestures. One evening, after a particularly long day, Edward came home with a bouquet of flowers and a box of chocolates. I thought you might like these, he said with a shy smile, handing them to Jacob. Jacob's heart fluttered at the gesture. It wasn't just the flowers or the chocolates, it was the thought behind them. It was the way Edward looked at him, the way his touch lingered just a little longer than before. There was something different in the air between them now, something unspoken but palpable. As their relationship deepened, Jacob found himself falling even harder for Edward. He cherished every moment they spent together, whether it was watching a movie on the couch or simply sitting in comfortable silence as they read books side by side. There was a quiet ease to their connection, a sense of safety and belonging that Jacob had never experienced before. Edward, too, seemed to be growing more comfortable with the shift in their relationship. He was still thoughtful and kind, but now, there was a tenderness in the way he looked at Jacob, a warmth in his eyes that hadn't been there before. It was as if Edward was learning to let go of the expectations he had once placed on himself, allowing his heart to guide him instead. One evening, as they sat together on the balcony, watching the sun set over the city, Edward turned to Jacob with a contemplative expression. "You know," he said softly, "I never expected my life to take this turn." Jacob smiled, feeling the weight of Edward's words. "Me neither." Edward reached out, gently taking Jacob's hand in his own. "But I'm glad it did." Jacob's heart swelled with emotion as he squeezed Edward's hand. There was no doubt in his mind that this was where he was meant to be, with Edward, in this moment, building a life together that neither of them had ever anticipated but both of them had come to cherish. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Jacob felt a sense of peace wash over him. For the first time in his life, he wasn't running from his feelings or hiding who he was. He was loved, truly and deeply, by a man who had become his home. As the days passed, the relationship between Jacob and Edward blossomed into something neither of them had ever imagined. There was a subtle shift in how they interacted with each other, an unspoken acknowledgement that their bond had deepened beyond friendship. Edward's gentle smiles held more warmth, and Jacob's quiet glances carried a weight that was impossible to ignore. It wasn't just about the romantic gestures, the flowers, chocolates, or surprise gifts, it was the way they both began to truly lean on each other. Jacob's initial fears of ruining their dynamic with his confession melted away, replaced by a growing confidence in the relationship they were building. He no longer felt like an outsider, a stray seeking shelter. With Edward, he felt like he had finally found someone who accepted him fully, with all his flaws, complexities, and emotions. One morning, Jacob woke up to the smell of freshly brewed coffee and sizzling eggs. It had become a comforting routine. Edward always made breakfast, ensuring that Jacob felt cared for, even in the smallest of ways. As Jacob stepped into the kitchen, he found Edward humming softly to himself, his back turned as he worked over the stove. "Morning," Jacob said with a soft smile, leaning against the counter. Edward glanced over his shoulder and grinned. "Morning. I made your favorite, scrambled eggs with some toast and fresh fruit. Thought you'd like a little extra today." Jacob chuckled, his heart warming at the effort Edward always put into the simplest tasks. "You spoil me." Edward shrugged playfully, setting the plates down on the table. "You deserve it." They ate in comfortable silence, the sound of the city outside a distant hum. Jacob found himself watching Edward closely, admiring the ease with which he moved through life. Despite the changes their relationship had undergone, Edward never seemed to lose his composure. He was still the same thoughtful, composed man who had taken Jacob in when he had nowhere else to go. As they finished their breakfast, Edward leaned back in his chair, his eyes meeting Jacob's with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. "I've been thinking," Edward began, his tone serious but gentle. Jacob raised an eyebrow, curious. "About what?" "About us. About where we're headed." Edward's gaze didn't waver, and Jacob felt his heart skip a beat. A knot formed in Jacob's stomach, uncertainty creeping into his mind. And Edward reached across the table, taking Jacob's hand in his. The gesture was so simple, yet it sent a surge of emotion through Jacob, making him realize just how much he had come to rely on Edward's presence in his life. "I've never been in a relationship like this before," Edward admitted, his thumb brushing lightly over Jacob's knuckles. "But with you, it feels right. It's different, but it's good. And I want to take the next step." Jacob's breath caught in his throat. "What do you mean?" Edward smiled softly, his eyes filled with warmth. "I want us to be more than just whatever we are now. I want to be with you, officially. No more hesitation, no more doubt. I want us to have a future together." Jacob's heart swelled with emotion, his chest tightening as Edward's words sank in. For so long, he had feared that his feelings would drive Edward away, that their relationship would remain undefined, hovering in a state of uncertainty. But now, hearing Edward's quiet yet firm commitment, Jacob felt an overwhelming sense of relief. "You really mean that?" Jacob asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Edward's grip on his hand tightened, his smile widening. Of course I do. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. Jacob felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes, a rush of joy surging through him. Without thinking, he stood up from his chair and moved toward Edward, pulling him into a tight embrace. Edward responded immediately, wrapping his arms around Jacob's waist and holding him close. The warmth of their embrace, the steady rhythm of Edward's heartbeat against his chest, was enough to chase away any lingering fears Jacob had. I want that too, Jacob whispered into Edward's shoulder. I want a future with you. They stayed like that for a long time, holding each other in the quiet of the morning, their unspoken promises filling the space between them. For the first time in Jacob's life, he felt truly, completely loved. And he knew that Edward felt the same. In the weeks that followed, their relationship grew even stronger. They started spending more time together outside of the apartment, taking walks through the city, visiting museums, and sharing dinners at small, intimate restaurants. With every moment they spent together, their bond deepened, and Jacob found himself falling even more in love with Edward. One evening, after a particularly romantic dinner, Edward surprised Jacob by taking him to the rooftop of their building. The view of the city was breathtaking, the lights twinkling like stars below them, and the air was filled with the crisp scent of night. Jacob leaned against the railing, gazing out at the skyline, when he felt Edward's hand slip into his. Beautiful, isn't it? Edward sighed softly, his voice filled with emotion. Jacob nodded, his eyes still fixed on the horizon. Yeah, it is. But when he turned to look at Edward, he realized that Edward wasn't looking at the city, he was looking at him. I've been meaning to do this for a while now, Edward sighed, his voice steady despite the nerves that flickered in his eyes. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Jacob's breath hitched in his throat, his heart pounding in his chest as Edward opened the box to reveal a simple but elegant silver ring. Jacob, Edward began, his voice filled with warmth and certainty, you've brought so much light into my life. You've made me see love in a way I never thought possible, and I can't imagine my life without you. I want to spend the rest of my days with you, if you'll have me. Jacob stared at the ring, his vision blurring as tears filled his eyes. He could hardly believe what was happening, but the look in Edward's eyes told him that this was real, that this was their future. Will you marry me? Edward asked, his voice soft but filled with hope. Jacob's hands trembled as he reached out, taking the ring from the box. Yes, he whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. Yes, I'll marry you. Edward's face broke into a wide smile, and without hesitation, he slid the ring onto Jacob's finger. They embraced, holding each other tightly as the city buzzed around them, oblivious to the quiet joy unfolding on the rooftop. For Jacob, it felt like everything had come full circle, from the boy who had been lost and abandoned, to the man who had found a love deeper than he had ever imagined. Their wedding was a small, intimate affair, held in the garden of a close friend's home. The ceremony was simple, but filled with love, as they exchanged vows under the soft glow of fairy lights. Edward looked dashing in his tailored suit, and Jacob couldn't stop smiling. His heart filled with happiness as he walked down the aisle. As they stood before their friends and exchanged vows, Jacob felt a deep sense of peace. He had never thought that this day would come, that he would find someone who loved him for who he was. But as he looked into Edward's eyes, he knew that he had found his home in the man standing before him. When the officiant finally pronounced them married, Edward leaned in and kissed Jacob softly, sealing their commitment with a promise of forever. The guests erupted in cheers, but for Jacob, the only thing that mattered was the man standing next to him, holding his hand as they began their journey together as husbands. The months that followed were filled with love, laughter, and the quiet joy of building a life together. They traveled, explored new cities, and made memories that would last a lifetime. But no matter where they went, it was the moments they spent at home, curled up on the couch, talking late into the night, that meant the most. Jacob had once thought that love was something out of reach, something meant for others but not for him. But now, as he sat beside Edward, watching the sun set over the horizon, he knew that love had found him in the most unexpected way. And it was everything he had ever dreamed of.